There are people in every community who feel like permanent fixtures, people you see so often, who smile so consistently, who help so freely that you stop thinking of them as individuals and start thinking of them as essential. They're the fabric holding neighborhoods together. When one of those people vanishes without explanation, the entire community tears at the seams. March 14th, 2020, Kaimuki, Honolulu. The metal shutters at Pualani's market stayed down past opening time. No lights flickered on inside. No one unlocked the door. The neighborhood institution that had served the community for over 60 years sat silent on Waialae Avenue, while confused customers checked their watches and peered through the windows. By 9 a.m., phones were ringing. "Where's Keone? Is the store closed today? Did something happen?" Something had happened. Keone Pualani was gone. Before we go further, I want to know where you're watching this from and what time it is where you are right now. Drop your location and the time in the comments below. It helps us understand our community across the world. And if you're interested in cases where the truth hides behind deleted messages and buried evidence, hit that subscribe button. This case will take you places you won't expect. Keone Pualani was 38 years old. He managed Pualani's market, the family-owned grocery store his grandmother had opened in 1959. Small but meticulously stocked, the market was known for the best poke bowls on the east side and shelves lined with everything from Portuguese sweetbread to Filipino longanisa. Keone knew every customer by name. He knew their kids' birthdays, their favorite snacks, which families were struggling financially. He'd extended credit during hard times, donated to Kaimuki Elementary School, sponsored youth soccer teams. On weekends, he volunteered with beach cleanups at Kaimuki Beach Park and played ukulele at community gatherings. He was the kind of person who made Kaimuki feel like home. That Saturday morning when the store didn't open, his absence felt like a structural failure. Something fundamental had broken. His cousin Makena Kealoha arrived at the store around 9 a.m. to find the metal shutters still down. She tried calling. His phone rang twice, then went to voicemail. She tried again. Same result. By 9:30, she was driving to his apartment in nearby Palolo Valley, a modest two-bedroom unit in a walk-up building with a lanai overlooking the lush Koolau Mountains. His car wasn't in its usual spot. The weathered blue Honda CR-V he'd driven for 10 years was gone. The apartment manager let her in. Everything looked normal. Bed made, dishes washed and stacked in the drainer. His surfboard propped against the wall near the door. But Keone wasn't there. By noon, Makena was standing in the Honolulu Police Department, filling out a missing person report with trembling hands. The officer who took Makena's statement was polite, but measured in his concern. "Adults go missing for all sorts of reasons," he explained. "Sometimes they need space. Sometimes there are personal issues nobody knows about. Give it 24 hours. We'll look into it." But Makena knew better. Keone didn't need space. He had responsibilities. The store was his life. His mother, Leilani, lived in Manoa and depended on his daily phone calls. He had a community that relied on him. He didn't just vanish. The last communication anyone had from him was a text to Makena at 10:37 p.m. on March 13th. A photo of the sunset from Makapu Lookout with a simple caption, "Clear head, clear heart." That was Keone, present, reflective, connected to the island he loved, not the type to disappear without explanation. Within hours, word spread through Kaimuki like wind through palm trees. By Saturday afternoon, neighbors were organizing search parties. Surfers who knew Keone from dawn sessions at Diamond Head joined shop owners who'd bought supplies from his market. They combed beaches from Diamond Head to Hanama Bay, checked hiking trails that wound through the valleys, knocked on doors asking if anyone had seen him. Volunteers printed hundreds of flyers. Keone's face smiled from every telephone pole, every shop window, every community bulletin board. Missing since March 13th. Last seen near Palolo Valley. Please call HPD with any information. The flyers became part of the landscape, a constant reminder that something terrible had happened to someone good. Friends started posting on social media. The Find Keone Pualani Facebook group exploded with activity. Hundreds of people shared theories, organized search grids, posted memories. Every theory felt plausible at first. Maybe he'd gone night fishing and had an accident. Maybe he'd driven to the North Shore for an impulsive overnight trip. Maybe his phone had died and he'd lost track of time. But as March 14th turned into March 15th, and then March 16th, every theory collapsed under scrutiny. Keone's bank account showed no activity after March 13th. His debit card was dormant. His phone went straight to voicemail. He hadn't contacted his mother, hadn't shown up at the store, hadn't responded to the dozens of people desperately trying to reach him. The truth was simpler and more terrifying. Keone Pualani had vanished into the warm Hawaiian night, leaving behind only questions and an unopened store. The break in the search came on March 17th, 3 days after Keone's disappearance. A jogger running along Kalanianaole Highway past Sandy Beach noticed something unusual. A blue Honda CR-V parked on a narrow dirt access road, tucked into a forgotten turnoff that separated the highway from the rocky coastline. The area was remote, thick with kiawe trees, overgrown brush, scattered lava rock. Locals sometimes used it for fishing access or late-night gatherings away from tourist areas, but it wasn't a place people went unless they knew it existed. The jogger ran past initially, but something made him turn back. The car had been sitting there motionless, driver's door slightly open. He called 911. By 10 a.m., Honolulu police had arrived. They approached the vehicle cautiously, unsure what they'd find. The keys were still in the ignition. The driver's door hung open like someone had just stepped out, intending to return in seconds. Inside, Keone's phone was wedged between the seats, battery dead. His wallet sat on the passenger seat, cash and credit cards untouched. A reusable shopping bag on the floor contained a 6-pack of Primo beer and a bag of Lihing Mui, sour plum candy. The receipt showed a purchase from a convenience store on Kalanianaole Highway near Hawaii Kai at 10:52 p.m. on March 13th. That was the last confirmed sighting. Security footage from the store showed Keone walking in, buying beer and candy, walking out to his CR-V in the parking lot. He'd seemed normal, maybe a little tired, but nothing unusual. He'd driven east on Kalanianaole Highway toward this remote access road. After that, nothing. Crime scene technicians descended on the scene within the hour. They photographed every angle, documented every detail. They collected trace evidence from the seats, dirt from the floor mats, hair from the headrest. They dusted for fingerprints and found Keone's throughout the interior, exactly as expected. But they also found partial prints on the exterior door handle and the hood, smudged, difficult to lift cleanly, impossible to match immediately. The ground around the CR-V told a complicated story. The surface was hard-packed dirt mixed with coral fragments, not ideal for preserving footprints. Investigators found tire tracks that matched Keone's vehicle, but also evidence of at least one other car. Wider tires with a different tread pattern, though weathering made it impossible to determine how recent they were. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no damage to the vehicle, no indicators of violence, It looked like Keone had parked, stepped out, and simply ceased to exist. McKenna arrived at the scene as technicians were loading the CRV onto a flatbed for transport to the police impound. She stood behind the yellow tape, arms wrapped around herself despite the warmth, watching them work. "Where is he?" she kept asking, her voice cracked with each repetition. "If his car is here, where is he?" Nobody had an answer. Detective Rodrigo Kalani took the lead on the case. A 22-year veteran of HPD, Kalani had worked missing persons investigations long enough to know that the first 48 hours were critical. That window where evidence was fresh, where witnesses remembered details, where trails hadn't gone completely cold. For Keone Puolani, those hours had already passed. But Kalani worked the case with methodical precision anyway, treating every piece of evidence like it might be the key that unlocked everything. The CRV went to the forensic garage where technicians took it apart systematically. They vacuumed the interior for trace evidence, tested surfaces for biological material, examined every inch of the vehicle for anything unusual. The results were frustratingly ordinary. The fibers matched Keone's clothing. The hair was his. The dirt was consistent with driving around Oahu. Nothing pointed to another person being in the vehicle. Nothing suggested violence. The location itself offered few clues. Kalani drove out there multiple times, studying the landscape at different hours. During the day, the access road was visible from the highway if you knew where to look. At night, it disappeared completely, shielded by vegetation and the absence of streetlights. Someone could park there after sunset and be effectively invisible. Why had Keone chosen this spot? The satellite searches on his phone proved he'd looked up this exact location before driving there. He'd known where he was going. But why? Kalani's team began interviewing everyone in Keone's life. They started with Anela Cruz, his ex-girlfriend. She was a nurse at Queens Medical Center, had dated Keone for 2 years before they'd split amicably in late 2019. She seemed genuinely shocked by his disappearance. They'd stayed friends, she explained, still texted occasionally, no bad blood between them. She showed detectives their message history, months of casual check-ins, shared jokes, the occasional "how are you" that required no response. The last message from Keone had come on March 10th, 3 days before he vanished. A photo of a weird customer request at the market with a joking caption. Anela had replied with a laughing emoji. Normal, unremarkable, nothing that suggested crisis. Kalani interviewed over 80 people, friends, customers, suppliers, former classmates from Roosevelt High School. Everyone described Keone the same way: present, generous, rooted in his community, completely reliable. He had no enemies that anyone knew about, no financial troubles, no romantic entanglements that would suggest drama. His bank account confirmed it: regular deposits from the market, modest withdrawals for groceries and gas. The most recent transaction was the convenience store purchase on March 13th. After that, his debit card went dormant. No withdrawals, no charges, no activity. Keone's apartment offered the same frustrating lack of answers. Everything was orderly. His laptop sat closed on the kitchen, your table. When detectives accessed it, they found nothing concerning. Emails about supplier orders, a half-finished playlist, browser history filled with surf reports and videos of Hawaiian musicians. His digital footprint was mundane, the online presence of someone content with his small corner of the world. But there was one detail that bothered Kalani. Keone's keys were missing. Not just his car keys, but his entire keyring, the one with the leather fob his mother had given him years ago. It held keys to the market, his apartment, his mother's house in Manoa, and one other key, a small brass key that nobody in the family could identify. If Keone had planned to disappear, why take a key ring that connected him to every part of his life? And if he hadn't planned it, where were those keys now? The search intensified. Cadaver dogs combed a 5-mile radius around where the CRV had been found. Trained noses seeking the chemical signature of decomposition. They checked the coastline, the hiking trails, the forgotten corners where a body might be hidden. They found nothing. Dive teams explored the underwater terrain. The coast there was treacherous, sharp lava rock formations and unpredictable currents that had claimed lives before. Maybe Keone had ventured down to the water and been pulled out to sea. But if that were the case, why were his belongings still in the truck? Why hadn't his body washed ashore? Phone records showed his last outgoing call had been at 9:14 p.m. on March 13th to a supplier about an order of fresh ahai. The text to McKenna at 10:37 p.m. had been sent from his apartment. Forensics confirmed it through Wi-Fi connection data. Somewhere between 10:37 p.m. and 10:52 p.m., Keone had decided to drive to Hawaii Kai to buy beer and candy. But why drive all the way to that convenience store when there were closer options? And why continue past it to that remote access road? The browser history from that evening revealed something that shifted Kalani's thinking. Between 9:45 p.m. and 10:15 p.m. on March 13th, Keone had searched for weather conditions, tide schedules, and satellite images of the coastline near Sandy Beach. The exact area where his CRV would later be found. The searches suggested premeditation. Keone had specifically chosen that location for a reason, but nothing else in his digital history explained why. Has something like this ever happened in your community? Someone you knew just vanishing without explanation? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because this case takes a turn nobody expected. By late March 2020, the initial urgency began to fade. Not because anyone stopped caring, but because there was nowhere left to look. Every lead had been pursued. Every witness had been interviewed. Every piece of evidence had been analyzed. The case file grew thicker with reports that all said the same thing: no answers. The world was also dealing with something else. COVID-19 hit Hawaii hard in March 2020. Stay-at-home orders went into effect. Businesses closed, tourism evaporated. The island that depended on visitors became isolated overnight. Honolulu Police Department resources stretched thin as they dealt with pandemic-related enforcement and a surge in property crimes as people struggled financially. Keone's case didn't close officially, but active investigation slowed to a crawl. The Find Keone Pualani Facebook group that had buzzed with hundreds of comments daily grew quieter. People still posted occasionally, sharing memories and expressing hope. But the daily urgency had faded. Life, with its relentless forward momentum, pushed the community to move on. But the Pualani family remained frozen on March 13th, unable to advance past that last text message, that last sunset photo. McKenna refused to let the case fade. She took a leave of absence from her job as a dental hygienist to focus full-time on finding her cousin. She organized weekly vigils at Kaimuki Beach Park. She maintained contact with Detective Kalani, calling him every few days for updates that rarely contained anything new. She posted on social media, kept Keone's face visible, reminded people that he was still missing, still mattered, still deserved answers. In June 2020, she hired Thomas Kane, a retired HPD detective turned private investigator. Kane was in his 60s, had worked missing persons cases for decades before retiring. He was unsentimental, warning McKenna up front that the statistics weren't encouraging. Most missing persons who weren't found in the first 72 hours either didn't want to be found or weren't alive to be found. But he took the case anyway. Something about the evidence bothered him, the way nothing quite added up. The abandoned vehicle with no signs of violence. The satellite searches suggesting Keone had chosen that location deliberately. The missing keyring. The partial fingerprints that didn't match anyone. Kane started from scratch, revisiting every interview, every piece of physical evidence. He drove out to the access road at different times of day, studying the landscape. During daylight it was exposed, visible from the highway if you knew where to look. At night it disappeared into darkness, shielded by vegetation and the absence of streetlights. Someone could park there after sunset and be invisible from the road. He wondered if Keone had chosen it for privacy, perhaps meeting someone he didn't want others to know about. But who? The investigation into Keone's social circle had been exhaustive. No secret relationships, no hidden conflicts. Kane re-interviewed Anela Cruz, Keone's ex-girlfriend. This time, without the formal constraints of a police interrogation, they met at a coffee shop in Kemuki. Anela was forthcoming, eager to help even months after the shock had settled into permanent sadness. She and Keone had ended things mutually, she explained. More about different life timelines than any fundamental incompatibility. She'd wanted to move to the mainland for a nursing position in Seattle. He'd been rooted in Hawaii, unwilling to leave the family business. They'd stayed friends in that genuine way some former couples manage. But during their conversation, Anela mentioned something she'd forgotten to tell police. A detail that had seemed insignificant at the time, but had been bothering her. About 2 weeks before Keone disappeared, maybe early March, he'd called her late one evening. Unusual for him. He'd sounded slightly off, distracted. When she'd asked if everything was okay, he'd hesitated before saying he thought someone had been watching him. He didn't elaborate much, said it was probably nothing. Just a feeling he'd gotten a couple times leaving the store at closing, like eyes on him in the parking lot. Anela had asked if he'd reported it, and Keone had laughed it off, said he was probably being paranoid, that running a business was making him jumpy. The conversation had moved on. Anela hadn't thought about it again, not until Keone's absence had recontextualized every interaction. Kane immediately brought this information to Detective Kalani. Together, they reviewed security footage from Puolani's market, grainy black and white feeds covering the parking lot and front entrance. Hours of review yielded nothing obvious at first. Customers coming and going, Keone locking up alone, his CRV pulling out onto Waiale Avenue. But on March 7, 2020, there was a brief clip that caught Kane's attention. Keone was closing the store around 8 p.m., pulling down the metal shutters. A dark SUV, possibly a Toyota 4Runner, drove slowly past on the street. It slowed almost to a stop, then continued. 40 seconds later, the same vehicle passed again, going the opposite direction. It was impossible to make out the driver. The license plate was obscured by glare from a streetlight. The SUV itself was generic, dark gray or black. It could have been nothing, a driver who'd missed a turn, or it could have been someone watching Keone. The clip lasted less than a minute. Without clearer footage, it proved nothing, but it gave shape to the paranoia Keone had expressed. Confirmed he'd had reason to feel watched. Summer brought new challenges. The Puolani family's savings dwindled as McKenna poured money into the search. Organizing new volunteer efforts, funding Kane's investigation, printing more flyers. Pualani's market, after sitting closed for months with a handwritten sign asking for prayers, was sold to a regional grocery chain. The new owners promised to honor its legacy, but immediately began renovations that erased the Pualani name from the storefront. It felt like watching Keone's life being dismantled piece by piece. Leilani Pualani, Keone's mother, aged visibly during those months. Her hands trembled as she clutched photos of her son during television interviews. The not knowing was its own form of torture. Worse in some ways than confirmation of death because it offered no closure, no endpoint to the grief. Just an endless loop of possibility and horror. On September 13, 2020, 6 months after Keone's disappearance, McKenna organized a vigil at Kaimuki Beach Park. Dozens of people showed up, far fewer than the initial searches, but enough to remind her that Keone hadn't been forgotten. They lit candles as the sun set, the flames wavering in the evening breeze. Stories were shared. Someone played ukulele, strumming somewhere over the rainbow. McKenna spoke briefly, her voice steady through sheer force of will, thanking everyone for keeping her cousin's memory alive. But inside, she was screaming. 6 months of searching, of hoping, of believing the next phone call would bring answers. And they were no closer than they'd been on March 14th, when she'd first stood outside that locked store. By August 2020, Honolulu Police Department had officially suspended active investigation. Detective Kalani assured McKenna the file would remain open, ready to be reopened if new information emerged. But the reality was stark. Keone Pualani had joined the ranks of the missing. One more name in a database of people who'd walked out of their lives and never returned. Except Keone hadn't walked anywhere. Every instinct, every piece of evidence suggested he'd been taken from his life. Ripped out of it by force or circumstance that left no witnesses, no traces, no answers. The case was cold. January 2022. Nearly 2 years after Keone Pualani vanished into that warm March night. Detective Nalani Rodriguez pulled his case file from the archives. Rodriguez was a 14-year veteran of HPD who'd recently joined the cold case unit as part of the department's Aiole Poiña initiative, Never Forgotten, a project launched in 2018 to systematically review Honolulu's backlog of unsolved homicides and missing persons cases using new forensic technology and investigative techniques. Rodriguez believed that technology evolved faster than police departments could keep pace. Tools that hadn't existed or weren't accessible in 2020 were now standard. Software that could extract deleted files, reconstruct fragmented data, analyze metadata in ways that revealed patterns invisible 2 years earlier. She started with Keone's phone, the iPhone that had been found wedged in his CRV seat, its contents downloaded and cataloged, but not exhaustively analyzed. The original investigation had focused on call logs, text messages, browser history, all the surface-level data. Rodriguez wanted to go deeper. She sent the phone's data to the FBI Regional Computer Forensics Laboratory in Honolulu, a facility that handled complex digital evidence for cases across the Pacific region. The technicians there used specialized software to perform what they called a deep extraction, pulling not just active data, but deleted files, cached images, app data that remained in the phone's memory even after users thought they'd removed it. The process took 3 weeks. Terabytes of information sifted through algorithms designed to flag anomalies and recover erased content. What came back changed everything. Buried in the phone's deleted files was a series of text messages from an unknown number, exchanges that had been manually erased from Keone's message history but remained recoverable in the device's backup cache. The messages began on March 8, 2020, and continued through the evening of March 13th. The sender's number was a burner phone, a prepaid phone that had been activated on March 6, 2020, and went dormant after March 14th. Never used again. The content of the messages was terrifying. March 8th, 11:51 p.m. You need to forget what you saw. Keone's response. Timestamped 11:58 p.m. Who is this? I don't know what you're talking about. March 9th, 2:17 a.m. Don't play dumb. Thursday night. The warehouse. You took pictures. Delete them. Keone, 2:19 a.m. I don't understand. You have the wrong person. March 11th, 10:34 p.m. Last warning. Meet me Friday night. Kalaniana Oli Highway past Sandy Beach. Mile marker 8:11 p.m. Come alone. We talk or your family gets hurt. Keone, 10:41 p.m. I don't know who you are or what you want. March 13th, 10:43 p.m. You coming or not? Final chance. Keone had never responded to that last message. Instead, according to the timeline established by his other digital activity, he'd spent the next 15 minutes searching satellite images of the coastline near mile marker 8. Then he'd texted McKenna the sunset photo. Then he'd driven to the convenience store in Hawaii Kai. Then he'd driven to that remote access road. Then he'd disappeared. The implications were staggering. Keone hadn't driven to that location on a whim. He'd been lured there, coerced by someone who claimed he'd witnessed something, who threatened his family if he didn't comply. The mystery of why he'd gone to such an isolated place at night evaporated, replaced by the horrifying certainty that he'd walked into a trap. But what had he seen? The messages referenced Thursday night, which would have been March 5th, 2020. The warehouse. Pictures. What warehouse? What pictures? Rodriguez called McKenna on a Thursday afternoon in late January 2022. McKenna was at work, her mind half present, as it always was now, constantly scanning for any sense that the universe might finally be ready to return her cousin. Rodriguez's voice was professional, but carried an urgency that made McKenna's hands start shaking before she'd even heard the words. New evidence. Digital forensics. Text messages that changed everything. Could they meet? They sat in a conference room at HPD headquarters the next morning. Rodriguez laid out printouts of the recovered messages. McKenna's face cycled through shock, confusion, rage, and a terrible kind of relief. Relief because, finally, after nearly 2 years of nothing, there was something. A direction. Proof that Keone hadn't simply wandered off or suffered some random accident. He'd been targeted, manipulated, pulled into something that had cost him everything. McKenna read the messages over and over. Her fingers traced the words Keone had typed. I don't know who you are or what you want. The confusion in that sentence broke her heart all over again. Imagining her cousin alone in his apartment, staring at his phone, trying to make sense of threats from a stranger, trying to decide if he should call the police or if that would make things worse. Rodriguez explained the next steps. They'd subpoenaed records for the burner phone number, though she warned these usually led nowhere. Burner phones were purchased with cash, activated without identification, designed specifically to be untraceable. But they'd try. They'd also revisit the timeline of March 5th, the Thursday night the sender referenced. What had Keone been doing that evening? Where had he gone? McKenna pulled out her own phone, scrolling back through her text exchanges with Keone from early March 2020. She found March 5th, saw that he'd texted her around 7:15 p.m. Closing up late tonight. Inventory hell. Might grab a beer after. She'd replied suggesting he get some rest. He'd sent back a tired emoji. That was it. She had no idea where he'd gone after closing the store. Who he might have seen. What he might have witnessed. The forensic team had also recovered something else from Keone's phone. A detail that had been overlooked in the original analysis because it seemed like random data. Buried in his photo library, among hundreds of images, was a single photograph taken at 9:22 p.m. on March 5th, 2020. The image was dark, clearly shot at night. Badly composed, as if Keone had been trying to capture something quickly without being noticed. It showed part of a warehouse or industrial building, visible through a chain-link fence. In the foreground, blurred by motion, were two figures standing near a white pickup truck, a Ford F-250. Their faces were indistinguishable, but their body language suggested an exchange of some kind. The photo was grainy, the available light minimal, but forensic image analysts believed they could enhance it, pull details out of the shadows that might identify the location or the people involved. If you're following this case closely, hit that like button right now and share this video with someone who loves true crime. Your support helps us bring more stories like this. And stay tuned, because what happens next is wild. The enhancement process took days. Forensic analysts ran Keone's photograph through multiple programs, each iteration revealing slightly more detail. They identified the truck as a white Ford F-250, common enough to be nearly impossible to trace without a plate number. One of the figures appeared to be holding something, possibly a box or container. The other was gesturing in what might have been argument or negotiation. The real breakthrough came when analysts focused on the background, the industrial building visible through the fence. By enhancing architectural features and comparing them against commercial property databases, they narrowed the location to the Mapunapuna industrial area, about 10 miles west of Kaimuki, near Honolulu International Airport. GPS data from Keone's phone confirmed he'd been in that vicinity on the evening of March 5th. His phone had pinged a tower near the Mapunapuna industrial corridor around 9:15 p.m. He'd stayed in the area for approximately 30 minutes before driving back toward Kaimuki, arriving home around 10:30 p.m. based on when his phone reconnected to his apartment's Wi-Fi. But why had Keone been in Mapunapuna that night? Pualani's market didn't do business with any suppliers in that area. His personal life showed no connections there, no friends or family living in Mapunapuna, no hobbies or interests that would draw him to an industrial park after dark. Detective Rodriguez theorized that Keone might have followed someone, perhaps noticing something suspicious earlier and pursuing it out of curiosity or concern. Or maybe he'd been asked to meet someone there under false pretenses, only to witness something he wasn't supposed to see, something that made him dangerous to whoever was involved. The investigation scope expanded. Rodriguez coordinated with HPD's organized crime unit to compile a database of everyone connected to the Mapunapuna industrial area. Tenants, employees, vehicle registrations. Anyone who'd leased warehouse space in the past 5 years. The area had a reputation among law enforcement, a hub for stolen goods, drug distribution networks, operations that needed space away from residential scrutiny. Several warehouses had been raided over the years for everything from prescription drug trafficking to stolen construction equipment. It was exactly the kind of place where witnessing the wrong thing could get you killed. One name surfaced repeatedly in peripheral ways: Derek Brennan. He was 51 years old in 2022, had lived on Oahu since 2016. He operated Pacific Imports LLC, a logistics company that claimed to import electronics and auto parts from Asia. He leased a warehouse in Mapuna Puna. On paper, he was legitimate, licensed, bonded, unremarkable. He lived in a rental house in Aiea, drove a dark gray Toyota 4Runner. But Rodriguez had learned to look beneath surfaces. She ran Brennan's name through expanded databases, interstate and federal systems that tracked individuals across jurisdictions. What came back was revealing. Before moving to Hawaii, Brennan had lived in Portland, Oregon. In 2014, he'd been investigated for suspected involvement in a stolen goods operation, specifically construction equipment that disappeared from job sites and reappeared for sale through online marketplaces. The investigation had stalled due to lack of physical evidence linking Brennan directly to the thefts, though informants had named him as a middleman who brokered deals between thieves and buyers. No charges were filed, but the investigation had made him radioactive in Portland's business community, prompting his relocation to Hawaii and reinvention as a supposedly legitimate importer. Rodriguez obtained surveillance footage from a neighboring business in Mapuna Puna, a plumbing supply company with a cloud-based security system that archived footage indefinitely. The original 2020 investigation had missed this entirely because nobody had known to look in Mapuna Puna. The footage from March 5, 2020 showed exactly what Keone's photograph had captured. A white Ford F-250 parked outside Brennan's warehouse around 9:20 p.m. Two figures engaged in what appeared to be a transaction, one handing something to the other before both climbed into separate vehicles and drove away. The quality was better than Keone's photo, clear enough to run facial recognition software. The software identified one of the figures as Derek Brennan with 91% confidence. The other individual was harder to match, his face partially turned from the camera. But the system suggested a possible match to a man named Koa Ikaika. Ikaika had a lengthy criminal record: theft, burglary, receiving stolen property. He'd been arrested multiple times in Honolulu between 2018 and 2020, served short jail sentences, and was known to investigators as someone who operated on the fringes of theft rings, stealing tools and equipment from construction sites and selling them to buyers who didn't ask questions about where they came from. The pattern became clear. Brennan was running a stolen goods operation disguised as a legitimate import business, using his warehouse to store items Ikaika and others stole, then redistributing them through channels that made them appear legal. Keone had somehow stumbled onto this operation the night of March 5th, possibly while driving home from his store. Maybe noticing Ikaika or recognizing stolen items that had been reported by contractors who shopped at Pualani's market. Kaimuki was a tight-knit community where people talked, where word spread quickly about thefts and losses. If Keone had seen something suspicious, his instinct would have been to investigate, to document it, to help if he could, never imagining it would cost him everything. Rodriguez brought Derek Brennan in for questioning on February 10, 2022. The interview took place in an interrogation room at HPD headquarters. Brennan arrived with a lawyer who specialized in white-collar crime and seemed mildly annoyed to be dealing with what he characterized as a fishing expedition. Brennan himself was calm, almost amused, a man of medium build with graying hair and a face that inspired neither trust nor suspicion. Perfectly anonymous. He answered questions with smooth deflection, admitted he operated a warehouse in Mapuna Puna, confirmed he'd been there on the evening of March 5, 2020, though he claimed not to remember specific details from 2 years prior. When Rodriguez showed him the enhanced photograph from Keone's phone, Brennan's expression didn't change. but something flickered behind his eyes, a micro-expression of calculation before he reset to neutral. His lawyer immediately intervened, called the photo evidence of unknown provenance, advised his client not to comment. When Rodriguez mentioned Keone Puolani's name, Brennan shrugged, said he'd never heard of him, didn't know about any disappearance, hadn't witnessed anything unusual. His lawyer threatened harassment lawsuits if the investigation continued without cause. The interview ended without breakthrough. But Rodriguez had won something, confirmation that Brennan was scared. The mention of Keone's name had unsettled him in ways he'd tried to hide but couldn't entirely control. The real break came from Koa Ikaika. In January 2022, Ikaika had been arrested for an unrelated burglary in Waipahu. He was sitting in jail awaiting trial when Rodriguez offered him a deal, cooperation in exchange for reduced charges. Ikaika, a pragmatic career criminal, didn't hesitate. In his statement, Ikaika confirmed Brennan's stolen goods operation. He'd been working with Brennan since 2018, delivering stolen tools, electronics, building materials. On the night of March 5, 2020, Ikaika had been dropping off stolen power tools at the warehouse when he noticed a blue CR-V parked across the street. Someone inside was taking photographs. He'd alerted Brennan, who reacted with immediate alarm. Walked toward the vehicle to confront whoever was watching them, but the CR-V drove away before he reached it, disappearing into the industrial park's maze of roads. Brennan had been furious, convinced they'd been compromised, that law enforcement was building a case. He'd told Ikaika to disappear for a while, lay low until they knew who'd been watching them. It was only later, after searching online for news of any investigations and finding nothing, that Brennan became convinced it hadn't been police, but a civilian, someone who'd seen something they shouldn't have, someone who now represented a threat. Ikaika didn't know how Brennan identified Keone, but he knew Brennan had resources, connections to people who could track down information, access databases that should have been secure. Brennan had called Ikaika on March 12th, 4 days after the photography incident, said he'd identified the person who'd been watching them, had his phone number, his address, everything. Brennan's plan was simple: scare Keone into silence, convince him that reporting what he'd seen would endanger his family, that cooperation meant safety and resistance meant consequences. The burner phone messages were part of that strategy. Escalating pressure designed to force Keone into a meeting where Brennan could assess the threat and neutralize it. What happened at that meeting on March 13th, Ikaika claimed not to know. He said Brennan had told him to stay away, that he'd handle it personally, that the fewer people involved, the better. Ikaika had followed instructions, kept his distance. Only learned about Keone's disappearance weeks later when he saw news reports about a missing grocery store owner in Kaimuki. He'd confronted Brennan, asked if the disappearance was connected to the guy who'd photographed them. Brennan had looked at him with cold eyes and said that problem has been resolved. Don't ask about it again. The statement was devastating, a roadmap to prosecution, but it was also circumstantial. The testimony of a career criminal with every incentive to minimize his own involvement and maximize Brennan's guilt. Rodriguez needed physical evidence, forensic proof that connected Brennan directly to Keone's disappearance, March 8, 2022. Nearly 2 years after Keone Puolani vanished. A team of investigators descended on Derek Brennan's warehouse in Mapunapuna at dawn. 24 law enforcement personnel from multiple agencies. Forensic technicians in white Tyvek suits preparing their equipment in the parking lot. The warehouse itself was a nondescript metal structure, painted industrial beige with a rolling door large enough to accommodate delivery trucks. There were no windows, no identifying signage beyond a small placard that read Pacific Imports LLC in faded letters. Inside, the space was cavernous, organized into sections separated by temporary walls of stacked pallets and industrial shelving. The front area contained what appeared to be legitimate inventory. Boxed electronics from Asian manufacturers, crates of auto parts, pallets of commercial goods still wrapped in factory packaging. Everything had proper documentation visible on clipboards. Invoices, customs forms that would satisfy a cursory inspection. But investigators had learned that legitimate businesses rarely needed to work this hard to appear legitimate. The deeper they pushed into the warehouse, the more the facade crumbled. The back section, separated from the public-facing inventory by a locked chain-link partition, told a different story. Here, the merchandise had no packaging, no invoices, no paper trail. Power tools, still bearing the logos of local contractors, were stacked in bins. Construction materials, copper wire, PVC piping, bags of concrete mix bore the kind of weathering that suggested they'd been sitting on job sites rather than in retail warehouses. The value of the suspected stolen goods ran into hundreds of thousands of dollars. A criminal enterprise that had been operating in plain sight for years. But Rodriguez wasn't there for the stolen merchandise. She was there for evidence of Keone Tanaka, any trace that he'd been in this warehouse. That Brennan had brought him here on the night of March 13th, 2020. The forensic team spread out with luminol and alternate light sources, searching for biological evidence that standard cleaning might have missed. They focused on the concrete floor, particularly areas that showed signs of having been recently sealed or repaired. Concrete is porous. It absorbs fluids that can remain detectable years later if you know how to look. The team sprayed sections of the floor with luminol, then dimmed the warehouse lights to near darkness, watching for the telltale blue-green glow that indicated the presence of blood. Nothing appeared in the main warehouse space. The floor had been sealed multiple times over the years. Layers of industrial coating that would have trapped any biological material, but also made detection nearly impossible. But in a small office area adjacent to the main space, separated by a door that hung slightly crooked on its hinges, the luminol reacted. A spray pattern appeared on the concrete near a floor drain, glowing an eerie blue in the darkness, the kind of pattern that suggested cleanup rather than accidental spill. The reaction was faint, degraded by time and whatever cleaning agents had been used, but it was there, persistent chemistry testifying to violence that someone had tried very hard to erase. The forensic team immediately cordoned off the office, treating it as a potential crime scene. They collected samples from the floor, the drain, the walls within the spray pattern's radius. Presumptive tests indicated the presence of blood, though they'd need DNA analysis to confirm whose blood it was and whether it matched Keone Puolani. The process would take weeks. Samples sent to the FBI laboratory in Virginia, where technicians would extract whatever genetic material remained and compare it against the reference sample collected from Keone's toothbrush, still preserved in evidence from the original 2020 investigation. While forensic work continued at the warehouse, other investigators executed a simultaneous search warrant at Derek Brennan's residence in Aiea. The house was a single-story ranch-style structure with a small yard enclosed by a chain-link fence, utterly unremarkable among the working-class homes that lined the street. Brennan wasn't there when police arrived, had apparently anticipated the search, and made himself scarce. His lawyer had been notified and appeared within the hour to observe proceedings. The search focused on Brennan's personal effects, looking for anything that connected him to Keone, clothing that might contain trace evidence, digital devices that could reveal communications or location data, weapons that might match any injuries Keone had sustained. In Brennan's bedroom, investigators found a safe bolted to the floor of the closet. It took a locksmith 40 minutes to crack it. Inside were stacks of cash, approximately $63,000 in used bills of various denominations. There were multiple false identity documents, driver's licenses and passports in different names but bearing Brennan's photograph. The kind of escape kit someone maintained when they expected their criminal enterprise might collapse and require rapid disappearance. Most significantly, there was a prepaid phone still in its original packaging. Identical to the model used to send the threatening messages to Keone in March 2020. The discovery of the unused burner phone was damning, but not definitive. Brennan's lawyer would argue it proved nothing. That many people kept prepaid phones for legitimate privacy reasons. That similarity to the phone used in 2020 was meaningless without direct evidence connecting his client to those specific messages. But combined with Koa Ikaika's testimony and the blood evidence from the warehouse, the circumstantial case against Brennan was becoming formidable. Investigators also seized Brennan's laptop, desktop computer, multiple external hard drives, and a tablet. All would be subjected to forensic examination for any trace of communications with Keone, searches related to his disappearance, or location data that placed Brennan near the access road where Keone's CRV had been found. The digital forensics took longer than the biological testing. Specialists working through encrypted files and deleted browsing history, reconstructing Brennan's digital footprint from the months surrounding Keone's disappearance. What they found was a portrait of paranoia and calculation. Brennan had searched extensively for news coverage of Keone's disappearance in the weeks after March 17, 2020, monitoring local news sites and social media for any indication that the investigation was closing in on him. He'd researched body disposal methods, searched for information about cadaver dogs and their limitations, looked into decomposition rates of human remains in tropical climates. The searches stopped after April 2020, as if Brennan had satisfied himself that whatever he'd done had worked, that Keone's body was hidden well enough to never be found. But the most damning discovery came from Brennan's financial records, specifically credit card statements from March 2020. On March 14, 2020, the day after Keone disappeared, Brennan had made several purchases at Home Depot in Waipahu. 2 bags of quicklime, a shovel, heavy-duty trash bags, and a bottle of industrial degreaser. The items individually were innocuous, the kind of thing someone might buy for legitimate reasons. Together, in the context of a missing person who'd last been seen driving toward a meeting with Brennan, they formed a narrative of premeditated disposal. The credit card statement also showed a gasoline purchase at a station in Waianae on the evening of March 13, 2020, far from Brennan's usual area, suggesting he'd driven west into the more remote parts of the island after meeting with Keone. Rodriguez coordinated with forensic geologists to analyze soil samples from Brennan's vehicle. They found traces of volcanic ash and coral fragments consistent with the Waianae area, but distinct from the soil composition near his warehouse or residence. The pattern suggested he'd driven to a specific location, spent time there in conditions that transferred soil into his vehicle, then returned. The DNA results came back on April 1, 2022. The blood recovered from the warehouse floor drain matched Keone Pualani with better than 99% certainty. The amount was small, degraded by time and cleaning attempts, but sufficient for analysis using modern PCR amplification techniques. The forensic report indicated that the blood had likely been deposited in 2020 based on degradation patterns and the chemical composition of cleaning agents found mixed with the biological material. It was the physical proof investigators needed. The evidence that placed Keone in Brennan's warehouse. That confirmed violence had occurred. That someone had attempted and failed to completely erase the traces. What do you think happened to Keone's remains? Do you think justice can truly be served without recovering a body? Let us know in the comments. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. We cover cases like this every week, and your support means everything. April 15th, 2022. Derek Brennan was arrested during a routine traffic stop in Pearl City. He was taken into custody without incident. Driving a rental car, had apparently abandoned his own vehicle in anticipation of arrest, but he hadn't fled the island, perhaps calculating that running would be an admission of guilt, or perhaps simply unwilling to abandon the criminal infrastructure he'd spent years building. He said nothing during booking, refused to answer questions without his lawyer present. Maintained the blank expression of someone who'd been through the system enough times to know that silence was his best defense. News of the arrest broke across Hawaii's media landscape. Local television stations interrupted regular programming. Arrest made in Keone Pualani case nearly 2 years after disappearance. The story dominated evening broadcasts, each update recycling the evidence while the fundamental horror deepened. McKenna received the call from Detective Rodriguez moments before the press conference. She sat in her car outside Pualani's market, which had been sold and rebranded. She wept with a relief so overwhelming it felt like drowning. Not relief that Keone would come home. She'd long since accepted he was gone. But relief that someone would finally be held accountable. That the person who'd taken her cousin would face justice, even if Keone himself could never be returned. The press conference was held at HPD headquarters. Detective Rodriguez stood alongside the chief of police and the deputy prosecutor who would be handling the case. They outlined the evidence carefully, conscious of not compromising the upcoming trial, explaining that new forensic techniques had allowed them to recover deleted digital evidence and identify blood traces that had been missed in the original investigation. They credited the Aioli Poina initiative, the FBI's forensic expertise, and the Pualani family's persistence. Specifically McKenna, whose refusal to let the case fade had kept pressure on the department to continue seeking answers. They acknowledged that while an arrest had been made, Keone's body had not been recovered. The investigation into his final resting place would continue. McKenna attended the press conference, standing in the back of the room surrounded by friends and family who'd supported her through nearly 2 years of uncertainty. When asked if she wanted to make a statement, she approached the microphone with trembling hands. She thanked the detectives, the forensic specialists, everyone who'd worked to bring her family this moment. She spoke about Keone not as a victim or a case number, but as a person. His kindness, his commitment to community, the way he'd made everyone feel valued and seen. She said that while Derek Brennan's arrest couldn't bring Keone back, it proved that some disappearances don't remain mysteries forever. That persistence and new technology could shine light into even the darkest corners. Then she made a plea directly, to Brennan, her voice breaking, but her gaze unwavering. "Tell us where he is. Please, let us bring him home." The arrest sent shockwaves through Oahu's business community. The revelation that Brennan had been operating a stolen goods ring, disguised as a legitimate import business, meant that dozens of local businesses had unknowingly purchased stolen merchandise, their own inventories potentially tainted by Brennan's criminal enterprise. HPD set up a hotline for businesses to report suspicious transactions. Within days, they were flooded with calls from contractors who now recognized tools and materials they'd bought from Brennan at suspiciously low prices as items reported stolen from their own job sites months or years earlier. But the stolen goods operation, while significant, paled beside the murder charge. The idea that Brennan had lured Keone to his warehouse, killed him, and disposed of his body with calculated precision horrified a community that prided itself on the aloha spirit, on looking out for neighbors, on the kind of tight social bonds that made violent crime feel like an intrusion from somewhere else. Keone hadn't been a random victim. He'd been targeted specifically because he'd witnessed something he shouldn't have, because he'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time, and had the conscience to document what he saw. The randomness of it, the sheer bad luck that had cost him everything, made people feel vulnerable in ways they hadn't before. The shock intensified when details about Derek Brennan's background began to emerge through media investigation and court filings. Reporters discovered that Brennan had a history far darker than his Portland investigation for stolen goods. In 2006, while living in Tacoma, Washington, he'd been questioned but never charged in connection with the disappearance of a business partner. A man named Michael Torres, who'd co-owned a freight company with Brennan before vanishing after the two had a falling out over missing inventory. Torres had been declared legally dead in 2013. His body was never found. The case remained unsolved. Brennan had left Tacoma shortly after the initial investigation, moved to Portland, reinvented himself again. The pattern was clear. When things got too hot, when someone became a problem, Brennan eliminated the threat and relocated, always managing to stay one step ahead of definitive proof. Prosecutors began exploring whether they could bring additional charges related to the Torres case, reaching out to Washington state authorities to see if new evidence in the Pualani investigation might shed light on the earlier disappearance. Derek Brennan pleaded not guilty at his arraignment. His lawyer argued that the evidence was entirely circumstantial. That blood in a warehouse, where many people had worked over the years, proved nothing about who it belonged to or how it got there. That Koa Ikaika was a career criminal whose testimony was worthless without corroboration. The prosecution countered with the DNA match, the digital evidence, the credit card purchases, the pattern of behavior that pointed unambiguously toward guilt. The judge set bail at $3 million, which Brennan couldn't meet, ensuring he'd remain in custody while awaiting trial. McKenna threw herself into trial preparation, meeting regularly with prosecutors to understand their strategy, providing background on Keone that would help the jury see him as a full human being. She compiled photographs, videos, testimonials from people whose lives Keone had touched, building a narrative that would ensure the jury understood what had been taken. She also continued pushing for searches to find Keone's body, coordinating with volunteer groups to explore potential burial sites in Waianae, hiring ground-penetrating radar specialists to survey properties that matched the profile of where Brennan might have disposed of remains. The search efforts were heartbreaking in their futility. The Leeward Coast offered thousands of potential burial locations, from abandoned fields to remote valleys accessible only by hiking trails, from empty lots overgrown with vegetation to rugged volcanic terrain. Without specific information about where Brennan had gone on the night of March 13th, the searches were educated guesses at best. Each negative result was a fresh wound, confirmation that Keone remained hidden, that even with Brennan in custody, the final answer of where her cousin lay remained elusive. On March 13, 2023, the third anniversary of Keone's disappearance, hundreds gathered at Kaimuki Beach Park. Candles were lit as the sun set over the Pacific. Stories were shared. A local kumu hula led a chant calling Keone's spirit home. Business owners spoke about his generosity. Surfers remembered his presence in the lineup. His mother, Leilani, now frail and worn by 3 years of not knowing, whispered his name into the wind. The trial is expected to begin in late 2023. Prosecutors are confident in their case, built on circumstantial evidence, digital forensics, witness testimony, and DNA confirmation. But without Keone's body, there's an incompleteness that haunts everyone involved. Brennan has never revealed where Keone is. He's maintained his silence, his final act of control. The search continues. Among the mysteries that remain is the small brass key that was on Keone's keyring, the one no one in his family could identify. Detective Rodriguez continues to investigate its origin. Security experts have examined photos of the key and believe it may belong to a storage unit or a small safe. If Keone was documenting Brennan's operation, if he was gathering evidence beyond that single photograph, the key might lead to something more. A storage unit with files, a safe deposit box with records. Proof that Keone knew he was in danger and tried to leave a trail. It's a small hope, a thread to pull. But in cases like these, small hopes are all families have. Makina keeps a copy of the key's photograph on her phone. She studies it late at night, wondering what door it opens, what secrets it might reveal, whether her cousin left behind one final message that might bring him home. Somewhere on Oahu, in the red volcanic soil, or beneath the dense vegetation of the Waianae coast, Keone Pualani waits to be found. His family waits for closure. The community waits for justice. The case is no longer cold. The arrest proved that technology and persistence can crack even the most carefully constructed lies. That deleted messages can be recovered. That blood traces can survive years of attempted erasure. That criminals who think they're smart enough to evade justice eventually make mistakes. But the case remains painfully incomplete. Without Keone's body, without that final piece of the puzzle, the Pualani family exists in a strange space between knowing and not knowing. They know what happened. They know who did it. But they don't know where. Derek Brennan sits in a jail cell awaiting trial. He could end this. He could tell investigators where Keone is. He could give the family the closure they've fought 3 years to find. But he chooses silence. Because giving up that information would be admitting guilt, would be surrendering the last shred of control he has left. And so the waiting continues. For a trial that will determine Brennan's fate. For a search team that might finally locate Keone's remains. For a brass key that might unlock answers nobody yet understands. Keone Pualani was 38 years old when he witnessed something he shouldn't have. When he took a photograph that would cost him his life. He was a good person who saw something wrong and felt compelled to document it, never imagining that simple act of civic conscience would make him a target. His story is a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself, that sometimes it operates behind legitimate facades, in warehouses that look like normal businesses, through men whose faces inspire neither trust nor suspicion. That good people can stumble into dangerous situations simply by being observant, by caring about their community, by being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But his story is also a reminder that cases don't stay cold forever, that families who refuse to give up, who keep fighting for answers even when the world has moved on, can sometimes find justice. That technology advances, that forensic techniques improve, that deleted messages and trace evidence can speak years after criminals thought they'd silenced them. The community of Kaimuki will never forget Keone Pualani. His name lives on in the stories people tell, in the market that once bore his family's name, in the youth soccer teams he sponsored and the beach cleanups he organized, in the poke bowls people still talk about and the kindness he showed to struggling families. He deserved better than to disappear into a March night. He deserved to grow old, to see the community he loved continue to thrive, to keep making people feel valued and seen. He deserved to come home. Somewhere on this island, beneath layers of soil and time, Keone waits. His family continues searching, and the brass key continues to guard whatever secret it holds. The case may be solved in the eyes of law enforcement, an arrest made, charges filed, justice grinding forward through the court system. But for the Pualani family, the case won't truly be closed until Keone comes home. Until then, they wait, they hope, they remember, and they refuse to let his name fade into silence.